today. This is our Uptown Village walking tour, so we're going to be heading north on Main, and we'll be talking about the buildings and the structures that are on this Main Street area right here. And we just want to thank you for coming out, because the purpose of the museum is to collect the history of the community, is to do research and present exhibits and whatnot. But also, it's also to have programs like this where we actually bring you out into the community and we talk about the history that we've been able to uncover of these various buildings, and actually to show how your city is very alive with history, especially in this downtown area. So we're going to start here. And so the Uptown Village area, there's a little story that starts with it. The area really grew around 1920s, 1923, 25. It started to expand. And this was centered around a celebration. So the citizens of Vancouver awoke on February 24th, 1924 to hear that articles had been filed for a grand celebration that would take place in Vancouver 1 year later. And that celebration was to mark the 100th anniversary of the founding of the historic Hudson's Bay site here in Vancouver. And so the city had always really had a close connection and an affinity to the Hudson's Bay and to the Fort Vancouver area. Now, many prominent citizens were actually involved in this, and W. Foster Hidden, J. Langsdorff, and George B. Simpson were all involved in the funding and planning for this event. Now, in June of the year that the event was supposed to take place, things were going along, but they ran into some financing issues, and there was a threat that this event would not actually happen. And now Vancouver had been getting national press for this great celebration that they were going to have on the Upper Main Street area, and they were actually in the Christian Science Monitor. They had a little piece that they talked about it, and it was said to be the premier event of 1925 in the whole Pacific Northwest. And so these financing issues were kind of worrying for the community. However, 1 month later in July, they had things under control, and they had the funding, and they set the dates for mid-August to have the event. So finally, in mid-August, they opened the doors to this great celebration, and the celebration was actually just a bit north of where the Uptown area is at, because all these new buildings were coming in, and the area just north of 39th area and up there was still completely empty. And so what they did is they built a facsimile of Fort Vancouver for the celebration in the area, which now we have one permanently down at the site of that space. And they had log walls that people could walk through, and they had all kinds of different structures that they built, and it was a very grand celebration, and it really marked the beginning of the growth of this area of the city. So now I'm just going to talk about this building real quick. This isn't necessarily a part of this growth. This building came in 1909, and this was originally a Carnegie Library, and this building was built with a $10,000 grant from the Carnegie Foundation. Now, that grant was made specifically for just the building. So this didn't include the books, the staffing, the furnishing, or the land. The community had to secure the land themselves for this. And so local businessman and brick manufacturer Lowell M. Hidden actually donated this plot of land right here. And this was originally a clay pit. And he would extract the clay and then take it across the street to the brickyard that they had in this area right here. If we look back there, you see that they had the hidden brickyard over there. And so they would extract the clay, go across the street, make the bricks, and then they brought them back to build the building, because these are hidden bricks that this building's constructed out of. And now the community donated $1,300 for books, and then the city also donated a couple other, another $1,000 for staffing and furnishings when this opened up. Now, when this was originally built, it was designed to hold 25,000 books, but by the 1960s, this building was holding 130,000 books, so far more than it was ever anticipated. So Vancouver and Clark County set to make a new library, and they built the new, now old library on Mill Plain, and this was taken over by the Clark County Historical Society, or at the time, the Fort Vancouver Historical Society. Now, one of the interesting things about this building is this is one of the first public buildings in Vancouver that had electricity. And so when this was installed in 1909, the librarians were kind of worried about this new technology, this electricity that they had to deal with. And so they actually had gas lamps originally installed in the building to light the building, because they didn't want to use the electric lights, because it was a bit worrisome for them to have to deal with those. So from here, we're going to go ahead and start walking up this way, but Ken's going to talk about how this part of the town and sections of this used to be where you could get a lot of cars.
Yeah. the automobile industry, or the retail automotive industry, started out down on Lower Main, Lower Washington, Lower Broadway. And in the 50s, it started moving up Main Street, and you'd find a lot of car dealers settled up here. The building kitty corner from us in the 50s was built for Quarter Oldsmobile. And then in the late 50s, it became the home of Foley Chevrolet. Next door was a Nash dealership. Up on McLaughlin and Broadway was Gilbert and Seibel Volkswagen. And it's kind of interesting, the first Volkswagen in Vancouver, how it got here and how it promoted interest in the Volkswagen. Dr. Miles Leeser, a dentist here in Vancouver, served in World War II in Europe. And while he was in Europe, he was fascinated by this Volkswagen.
The people's car.
Yeah, the people's car. The Volkswagen. Anyway, so as soon as the war ended, he had one shipped here to Vancouver. So he had the very first Volkswagen in Vancouver. And it really created a lot of interest. Therefore, not too many years later, they opened a Volkswagen dealership here in Vancouver. But a lot of the dealerships moved up into this area, and you'll find that later on, of course, they moved out to the east side of town.
And if you're familiar with, you're driving down Highway 14, you see Leeser Road. His family is the namesake for that road. They were prominent doctors and a dentist in the community, and they had a quite interesting story. And on our native tour, we actually talk a lot more about that family history, so you can hear that on that tour. So as we're standing here, I'm going to point to this building right across the street here. And this is a key part of Vancouver history that you may not have known. So this building here originally housed the Holland Creamery. And this building was built in two phases. And this north side here was built around 1920. Now, the story of the Holland Creamery talks about an immigrant from the Netherlands, Jack Propstra, who came to the Vancouver area and the Clark County area, and he began to establish a business. And originally, he purchased a creamery and a dairy out in the Ridgefield area that was defunct. It was going out of business, and he had it within a couple years in paying order and working really well. And so he was quite a businessman and knew his trade pretty decently. And then a couple years after that, around 1922, or a couple years actually around 1918, he actually established the Vancouver Creamery, which he ran in this area, and he ran that for 4 years and was quite successful. And then eventually he moved over to Portland into a venture with his brother. And after some time away from the community, he eventually came back to this building right here and established the Holland Creamery, where he made rich ice creams and great dairy products. And eventually he opened up a little front store area in this building and began to serve food and ice cream and different things. And this eventually became the Holland Restaurant. Now, after many years of running this restaurant, Jack eventually passed the business on to his sons, and his son George eventually took it over. And George, and this is around the 1960s that he took this over, he was interested in this new craze. You know, these were the sit-down restaurants, but he was interested in this new craze of the fast food restaurant. And so he went and he built a little structure, little brick structure, and he called that structure Burgerville. I know, it's the long con on this one. And so George Propstra started Burgerville, and when Burgerville first opened in '61, you could get, the menu included 19-cent hamburgers, shakes, lime freezies, and I'm sure everyone's favorite, the shrimp burger that you could get when it opened. And so this site here is a heritage site for the company that became Burgerville and the Propstra family that was in this area. So we're going to go and walk up here, and we'll take a look at what used to be the first Christian church. That was the second one. Yeah, the first one was at 415 Mill Plain, and that one was taken out when I-5 came through the area, and then this one that was there was the second Burgerville. And I don't know where the third's at. So.
Schofield Corner has been here for many decades, but from the mid-30s until the late 60s, there was a Safeway store here. And if you've been on any of the other tours, it seems like every tour we talk about Safeway. And I've been able to identify about 10 sites from the end of Main Street up to 41st Street where there was a Safeway store. But they were here for probably the longest period of time. They were here until the late 60s when they built a store up on 41st and Main and closed this particular store.
Yep. And so we'll go in up here and we'll take a look at this church, and I'll talk about that a little bit. And as you see here, as we look at the Schofield corner here, you see established 1928, because before that time, before they really started to develop this area as a business district, there were houses that were right in this spot. And then you go down to this block and you have this building here, which is one of the older structures on the Uptown area. But if you went just north of that building there on the corner, that also would have been all houses until the 1920s and 30s. So it was a house, a residential district at that time. But this building was built circa between 1923 and 1925, and this was the first Christian church of Vancouver. And this sprouted up during that period of growth in the 1920s. And this building was dedicated at the tail end of the centennial year. And the congregation that it housed, the first Christian congregation, actually laid its roots in Vancouver in 1890. So it was quite an old congregation in the area. Now, this individual didn't actually do anything at this church, but Vancouver does have its very interesting priests and parsons and parishioners in the area. And one of the most famous priests in the area was Reverend A.D. Skaggs. And he was quite prominent, and he actually was said to be the marrying parson of the Northwest Grenada Green. And at one point, Skaggs had claimed that he married 6,193 people. Not himself, but pairs. Right? Not. I don't know if that's legal. Which he said was probably a world's record, and that he had baptized 7,393 children with his own two hands. And then he had claimed off to the side that he had lost count of how many people he had buried in services. So anyways, but this was this is a neoclassical style building here, and this is just beautiful, and it has a very interesting dome and cupola at the top, which kind of is a little different in the style. You usually wouldn't see that too much. And this is just a beautiful building. And if you look at the bricks of this building very closely, you'll notice that they make little cross patterns. And whether that's intentional, I'm not sure, or if that was just a very prominent style at the time, because there are several houses in the Houck neighborhood that also have that pattern. But it's very neat to look at. And they still have their cornerstone over in the building to the north right there.
An interesting part about this church, while the first Christian congregation no longer worships here, they still exist in the United States. It's a mainline Protestant church. They only number about half a million people throughout the United States, and they refer to themselves as the disciples of Christ.
Mm-hmm. And the congregation that originally was in this church, they still do worship in a building behind this building. It's more of a 1940s building that eventually, as their congregation lost membership, they moved into that, and now Compass Church today takes care of this. And we'll talk about this building real quick, just very shortly. So you see the name up here at the top, Collings. So this was owned by A. Collings, and he actually ran a grocery store out of this business. And this business is early 20th century, probably circa around 1911 that this was built. And this was one of the earliest grocery stores. And in the 20s, when this area started to see businesses growing, you actually saw Collins, who had been here for several years, actually move out and go further down Main to where there seemed to be less competition for him as this new area was growing. And he was also the son of a prominent bailiff in the area, and it still has their family name up on the building here. And then Ken actually knows a little bit about the later history of this building.
Yeah. In the 50s and 60s, if you went to high school here in Vancouver and you played sports, you got your Letterman's jacket or Letterman's sweater right here at Shields Sporting Goods. And they were a prominent business here on Main Street for many decades.
So we'll head up here and I'll point out this building as we walk by. Sorry. And this site used to be the site of Piggly Wiggly's. So we'll just look at this building real quick here. This building at one point was Mission Beauty and Barber Shop. And now the name is really interesting because as we walk up here and we look up the street in just a few, we're going to go to what used to be the Mission Theater. Now, this barbershop actually started before 1936 up near the Mission Theater area, and it was just south of the theater. And so you had the Mission Beauty and Barbershop, the Mission Theater, and then the Mission gas station. So it was kind of a whole area that was taking on the name of the Mission, and it was because the theater that we're going to talk about up here was the first Uptown theater in the area. But anyways, in 36, from about 36 to 1980s, this was the Mission Beauty and Barber Shop, and it was owned by several different people. And this site, for as long as I can find, has been the site of a beauty and barber shop for some time. So this is quite an interesting piece of history right here.
This building across the street from us, where Main Street Trader is, this building is called the Greeley Building. It was built in 1928. The question was asked about a shield that was built into the wall of the Collins building. You'll see similar architectural features in this 1928 building. You'll also see similar architectural features in the building that now houses the Tip Top Tavern. This started out as, I believe it started out as a store, a grocery store. Again, grocery stores were very, very common up and down Main Street.
And you'd have several different little grocery stores instead of a major market. You'd have little grocery stores that people would frequent from the neighborhoods and whatnot.
Excuse me, I need to correct myself. It started out as a hardware store.
So we're going to pause here real quick on this corner, and then we're going to head up to the theater where we're actually going to get to take a look inside. So we talked about the Vancouver Creamery just a little while ago right down there, and that's where Doolin's is at today. Well, as you can see on the sign, Doolin's has applied for a liquor license at this site, and they're going to be here eventually. And this was the Vancouver Creamery. So Doolin's just keeps the scene following the trail of the Propster family's history here. So I believe this building, so a lot of times with buildings, it's really hard to establish when they were built, but from what I can tell, this was probably built around 1911. The earliest maps that seem to depict that this structure was here. And what it shows is it shows a market, a meat market here on the map, and then it's house, 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 and nothing else. So this looks like this is one of the older structures. And around 1918, Jacob Propstra had the Vancouver Creamery within these walls. And so this is another heritage site in that history, and eventually will be a great restaurant that you can go to. And so we're going to go up because we've got some people waiting for us to head into that Mission Theater, which is up the road from here. And this site was also Evergreen Laundry, which you may remember if you've been around, because it was around till about the 1980s. Okay. So if you want to go and head in there, and I'll turn the mic down. So yeah, we'll talk about this when we pop back out, but if you want to go and take a look inside right now.
Yeah, this used to be, this was originally the New Society Theater.
Mission Theater.
And then it was the Mission Theater. And then years later, it was the Skyline Sports Shop.
Correct.
And at the Skyline Sports Shop, kids would line up on winter weekends, rent their skis here. The bus would pick them up here, take them up to Mount Hood. And so, yeah, this was quite a place. This has got a rich, rich history. And the first film that was shown here was Captain Blood.
Yep. And
Starring
Olivia de
Earl
Havilland.
And what year was that?
It was 1927. Yeah.
Okay, okay. And then later it was a shop for auto repair. This is an architect's office. LSW architecture firm. They, just as a little bit of background, they do all the design work for Vancouver School District, Evergreen School District, Clark College, Ridgefield School District. They've been doing that since 1955. Many, many years ago, I worked as a union electrician in the area, and I had the opportunity to work on 3 of their projects. And so I know their work well, and I appreciate their work.
And when this theater was originally built, it seated about 616 people. So we're going to walk up here, and Ken's going to solve the mystery for all of us why High School Hardware has its name.
I want to talk about some significant buildings that are here now and that used to be here. On the corner of what was once 26th and Main, which is now 4th Plain in Main, was a high school that was built, completed in 1912, Vancouver High School. During World War II, it was the largest high school in the state, double-shifted students because of the huge amount of workers that were imported. The high school took up, it went from 26th Street down to 24th. Everything has been replaced, everything has been raised, and new buildings have been put in. But they were built in, that was built in 1912, stayed in existence until about 1970. Across the street from the high school, it was a store owned by Edith and Ira Nelson. They opened it up in 1925, and they simply called it High School Store. And then later, in 1939, Ken and Matt Zapp bought that building, renamed it High School Pharmacy. They put a pharmacy in there. And then later, Matt Mullen owned it, and in '67 it was sold to Steve and Jan Oliva, and they owned it for many, many years. In fact, they still own the building, but they sold most of their stores. While all this was going on, he kept adding stores around the area. They were all called high school pharmacies, but he ended up selling most of them to Walgreens. But he kept this particular store. It kept the building, and so that's how that building got its name. This building right behind you, for many years, was Gormley's drugstore. And I believe the Gormley family is still around Vancouver. And so there's a lot of history up and down Main Street, but a lot of history related to the high school. The high school changed its name in 1956 from Vancouver High School to Fort Vancouver High School because of the construction of Hudson's Bay High School. So you had a question?
Northeast corner of that building, wasn't there Wolf's Appliance?
Yeah. On the east side, there was actually two buildings there. On the east side was Wolf's Radio and Electric. They sold stereos, radios, TVs, and they were there until the late 70s, and they built a new store out on Thurston Avenue across SR 500 from the mall. They weren't there very long before they folded their tent. But yeah, you're correct. The other side was Wolf's, this side was High School Pharmacy. And Safeway had a store in there at one time too. In the 70s. I'm not sure exactly what year in the 70s. Their last class, I believe, was 1970. They tried to save the auditorium. For many years, the auditorium was used for the Miss Washington pageant. Beautiful auditorium, had all the accoutrements that an auditorium would have, and they had the Miss Washington pageant there for many, many, many years. And they tried to get the folks around here tried to get the Hidden family to make an investment in the auditorium, much as they did Providence Academy. But the Hidden family felt that they had enough with Providence Academy.
Enough to handle.
Yeah.
And then eventually there was a fire,
Yeah.
which damaged the building, and then it was torn down. So we're going to head down and we'll take a look at a couple of our last sites for today. So Ken will give us a little history on the Tip Top, and then we're going to finish off with the one house on our tour, and we'll finish with talking about this house right here.
Tip Top Tavern's been here forever. Well, not forever. The building they're in was built in 1925. It was built for a grocery store. And you'll notice on where they front Main Street, there are two front doors. Well, the door on this side was for the grocery store. There was a hardware store right next door. And it existed for many, many years. The Tip Top finally bought that and removed the walls. So it looks a little different than it did when I had my first beer here. In fact, many residents that lived on the west side of Vancouver can claim this is where they had their first beer. I talked to one of the staffers in there, and they told me many times it was illegal. They weren't quite 21, but they turned, they turned their head on that one. So anyway, again, you can see the architectural features with the shields and the brick. 1925 is this building.
So this is our last site for the day. If everyone wants to gather around, we'll take a look at this. And this is the house that I'm going to coin as the Beauregard house. Now this house was built around 1910, circa that time, and this was occupied by J.J. Beauregard and his wife Elizabeth. Now Beauregard had come to Vancouver during his service, and he was with the U.S. military, and he was actually discharged at Vancouver Barracks. And upon his discharge, it was around 1894 that he was discharged. He moved into the city, and he started a pawn shop. And now he ran this pawn shop for many, many years in the community. And you could see at the time when he was running this pawn shop between 1912 and 1919 that this wasn't quite the safest business for him. He had some accounts in the paper where he had to deal with an individual who was impersonating a deputy sheriff, and he was bouncing checks when he was trying to buy some revolvers from his pawn shop. And then in another case, he had several guns that were stolen from him, and they had to track the person down in Portland who was trying to sell those on the street. Now, Beauregard had an interesting life, and he was a quite wealthy man, so he was able to go on trips. And one trip he decided to go on was to California. And as he was taking his trip in California, this is around 1918, he was driving through the Mojave Desert, and he got lost. And upon getting lost, he continued to try and drive and find his way, but eventually his car overheated and his radiator boiled out completely. And so he's completely stranded here in the middle of the Mojave Desert. And this, so then the news report states that he had quick thinking to remember that he had a watermelon in the back of his car. And so he took the watermelon and put it in a bucket, and he crushed it up in the bucket and then poured the water from the crushed watermelon into the radiator and was able to make it to the next watering hole. And the article's title was "Melon Saves Motorist." And I was talking to someone earlier today, and that story is amazing to me, that we could find that the individual, while he was living in this house, had that day. So any day that I find a story like that is definitely a Melon Saves Motorist day for me. It's an amazing day. Now, unfortunately, Beauregard's life-saving effort was all for naught in the end, because 1 year later he actually died. And the way that happened was he was actually at his pawn shop at 702 Main, and he was having an argument with his wife over him going on a hunting trip, and she actually ended up shooting and killing him after that argument. Her initial claim was that she was just trying to frighten him because she was upset about the argument that they had, but she'd actually fatally wounded him. And being a very loving husband, in his dying words, as he was at St. Joseph Hospital, he said, "Please do not do anything to my wife for her," as he said it, rash decision. And he didn't want her to be prosecuted for the shot that killed him. So this actually became a big event in Vancouver, and it went on until November. This was in August when he was shot, and the trial went on into November. She actually spent 2 months in jail, and she was released for just a day to attend his funeral. And the reports were that she was so grief-stricken that she nearly was just overcome with grief because of what she had done. And then eventually, in late November, she was acquitted. And it was acquitted on accidental shooting charges. And she actually remained in this house right here until 1931 with her daughter. And then after that, no one really knows. Don't really know what's happened to her after that. But this house definitely has a very interesting history when it ties to the Beauregard family, and some very interesting stories. And with that, I want to thank everyone for coming out today. I'm going to walk back to the museum. If anyone's heading back there, we can go inside and I can give you a tour of the interior and we can talk about some of that. But yeah, thank you for coming out today.
Thank you.